Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today, I'm going to be doing my round two tips for who beats who. This is going to be hopefully released on the Wednesday, so the day before the round starts. And I'm going to be talking about every game in as much detail as I think is necessary and giving my thoughts on who will win. Let's get into it. To start with, it is St Kilda versus Collingwood at the MCG on the Thursday night for Spuds game. As you can see, I'm a Saints fan and I have the Spuds game scarves from last year. Um, I think it's going to be a really good game. I think it has the potential to easily be game of the round. St Kilda lost, unfortunately, against Geelong. They were outplayed for majority of the game, I would say. They just couldn't stop specifically Dangerfield in the midfield. He really took control of the game, was able to break clear from stoppages a few too many times. Seb Ross couldn't quite handle him. I think he was the matchup, and he got subbed out in the third quarter. And they made a big comeback late, got it within a point with 2 minutes to go. But then obviously Dangerfield stood up and kicked the crazy set shot. I was right behind it, and it was a bit frustrating. I never really believed. I thought it was a fake comeback, and to me, it actually felt ironically very similar to our game last year against Collingwood, where we came back and then almost got a match tying goal if there was a free kick to Mitch Owens in the end. But Collingwood, I somehow didn't get to watch their game. I was working on Friday night, but from what I've heard, they were outperformed quite badly, and apparently if Sydney had a kick straight, then they would have been absolutely done by half time. So that's really poor. Their forward line seems to just be not working. They can't get Cox or Cameron and then Myercheck and Johnson just to click. And I think just on Johnson, he's had to delete all his social media due to the backlash. And from what I heard, they were booing him every time he got the ball and cheered for him when he got subbed out of the game or when he went off the ground, which it's a disgrace, really. You're fans of the team. If a player's not performing, you're not giving him shit. You're supporting him through it to get his best out of him that you possibly can as a fan base. And I think that's part of Collingwood's fans, and they need to lift about that. So he probably does get dropped. A couple of their players do need to stand up. Darcy Moore needs to take control of that back line. It has been blown out a little bit in the last 2 weeks. And so if they want to be able to win, he needs to do that. But it'll be a really interesting game. You've got St Kilda's defense against Collingwood's forward line, which will be really interesting. Teams have been able to slow down Collingwood's ball movement through the middle, and it'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to score as heavily as they could, or as they normally would, against St Kilda's defense. And then St Kilda's forward line, again, it's the entries and it's the efficiency with their shots. I think it was quite high efficiency, but that's because we had so many shots against Geelong. It'll be interesting to see how Collingwood's defense holds up this week, whether they get back to their best or if they stay in this slump. If I were to make a decision, I would be going with Collingwood because I see them bouncing back. 0-2 is not good, but 0-3 is even worse, and I see them getting a win by about 11 points. Next is Adelaide versus Geelong in Adelaide, and I think Tex Walker should be back for this game. He was obviously a huge miss for them up against Gold Coast up there, and it's unfortunate that he missed. I heard Kane Corn say something weird about it. I'm not going to look into further about him just missing a flight or not being able to catch the flight, which is weird. But if Adelaide's forward line is with Taylor Walker, I just see them potentially being able to get on top. I think their smalls could be really, really dangerous. You've got Rankin, who is playing more midfield time, but you've also got Rochelle, you've got Murphy, you've got Saligo if he plays there. You've just got a lot of danger. And I think if they can get that on top, I think their backline will struggle against Hawkins and Cameron, but they'll be able to deal with the rest. And I think their midfield with Dawson, with Laird, with Crouch will be able to get on top of Geelong's midfield. So I've got Adelaide winning in a relatively close game that I think they'll kick the last couple goals by 16 points. North Melbourne versus Fremantle. Fremantle have obviously had a great upset against Brisbane. They were able to come back from 4 goals down in the early parts of the first quarter, kicked a couple late and were just able to really control the game from there. They knew what they were doing, and they were able to hold up defensively really well until Brisbane made a little bit of a late push, but weren't able to get close. Their midfield, obviously, Sarong had a brilliant game with 46 touches, and that's super impressive. To do that in your first game of the first, not your first season, but in your first season after really performing to a super high standard is great, and it shows that he is here and he is going to be a superstar for the future. And it's a real upset for them, and it's great for their confidence. Their forwards worked, but then again, it was in Fremantle, and I think that's sort of their problem with their forward line. It's whether they can produce that again in not in Western Australia. And then North Melbourne were pretty courageous. I think against GWS, they were able to get it within a goal. I think around half time ish or just before GWS were able to push it back outside of the 4 goal gap, which is probably the safe zone. And then they just sort of controlled the game from there. North's backline, it's a big issue, and I think if Fremantle, their smalls get on top, then I think Fremantle will win. And so I have Fremantle winning by about 4 goals. Hawthorn versus Melbourne. This is after the tribunal. Well, I'm recording this after Sicily's tribunal, so he's able to play. So that's going to be huge for Hawthorn because they really, outside of Frost, they don't have another key defender. But even still, with Melbourne coming off a great win against the Bulldogs, it's at the MCG. I have Melbourne winning. Their midfield got back to its best. Gawn had a great game. Oliver was exceptional with 35 touches. And then Pachaka and Viney are just solid, really, really good players as always. So I see Melbourne getting this done by just over 5 goals. Next, we have Sydney versus Essendon in what could be a good game, I think. You've got Sydney being probably the most, or at least second most informed team of the competition at the moment. Isaac Heaney's been arguably the best player in the competition. Don't think there's too much contest there. He's been the most highly rated player by Champions data, which look into however you like, for the last 2 rounds, which is really impressive. He's been exceptional for them in the midfield. Got McCartan, Melican, Rampy, Blakey locking down the tools for Sydney in their back line, which the McCartan pick from our Australian team's actually looking not too bad. You've got the forwards looking really good. McDonald had a great game against Collingwood. Heaney and Hayward are looking great as smalls. And so I think Sydney are probably the favourites, and they should be. But Essendon, again, how they performed with their stoppage work against Hawthorn was great. They were able to get out the front of the stoppage a few too many times, which is a big problem with Hawthorn, which I didn't really say because I wanted to talk about it more with Essendon. Merritt was really, really good as always. And then Gresham actually had a pretty good game in his first campaign for Essendon. And they were able to be pretty good defensively as well against Hawthorn, although Hawthorn weren't very accurate. But I think Sydney should be able to get this done. And they are normally close games between these two. And I do think that will happen again. So I'm going Sydney by just over a goal. We've got Western Bulldogs versus Gold Coast next. Another quite interesting game. I think both teams are situated about the same spot. It is in Eureka Stadium, so that's going to be a bit interesting. I think the result last year of this was that Gold Coast barely beat the Bulldogs, but correct me if I'm wrong. The Bulldogs midfield is more experienced. It's a bit more damaging, I'd say, with Bontempelli and Liberatore, but it's actually quite a good few similarities. You've got Liberatore and Rao being those in and under midfielders. You've got Bont and Anderson as the more outside running midfielders. Then you've got Treloar and Miller, and I think that would be a really good battle. You've got, I think, Gold Coast defense and their new system will be able to get on top of the Bulldogs forward line with Norton, Ugle-Hagan, and Lobb. And I think Gold Coast forward line as well will be a bit more damaging than what the Bulldogs' backline will be able to contain. So I have Gold Coast winning by probably 2 to 3 goals in the end. And it's also not at Marvel Stadium, which probably would have slightly altered my decision, I think, for the Bulldogs. Next is Richmond versus Port Adelaide. It is at the MCG, so it's a home game for Richmond. And I think with the way Richmond performed last week against Carlton, instead of how they performed up at the Gold Coast, Lynch, Martin, and Nankervis are huge ins at the moment. They're probably their three best players and their three most important players to how they want to play. And that obviously makes a huge difference with how they perform. They were able to really push Carlton, and they were very, very close to beating them. During the week, I actually thought potentially changing my tip to Richmond because I just felt like something was coming. Luckily, I didn't, and I got it right. But they really did push Carlton, and I'm actually quite surprised at how they performed. Noah Bolter was fantastic. I thought he could have been best player on the ground if Richmond had won, but they didn't. And then Port Adelaide had just a good win against West Coast. Rosie and Butters were brilliant. Charlie Dixon was absolutely bossing Tom Barras, so that's great to see. And their back three of Zerk Thatcher, Radaglia, and Alir worked quite well, I thought. But again, it was against West Coast, so how much can you really take out of it? I think, tip Port Adelaide simply because of how much effort Richmond put into their game against Carlton. And I think also with the new injuries they've got with Gibcus, with Miller, I think it might have been Young though, and Prestia not being able to play, I think they'll be able to get slightly exposed with Dixon playing as well as he did. So I've got Port Adelaide winning by just over 20 points. The next game is West Coast versus GWS in Perth. And I think this one's pretty obvious. GWS probably are the most informed team in the competition. It's not too much to say about that. They beat Collingwood in round 0, and then they beat North at round 1. Their forward line has been clicking, which was probably their biggest weakness. Their back line is just as strong as ever, and their midfield is really rolling at the moment. Kieran Briggs didn't have the best game, but I think this week he can look to really get his season going against West Coast. Obviously, no Matt Flynn, which would have been a big thing for him. But I think this one will be pretty obvious. GWS should, and if they don't, it'll be disappointing. They should get over the line. And I think not too dissimilar to Port Adelaide, they'll just hang around West Coast for the first 3 quarters, probably this time because it's at home. But then I think GWS, by the time the game's finished, will kick it out to about a 40-point margin by the end. So that's going to be this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button. It'll really help push this video in the YouTube algorithm and grow my channel. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of content. There's going to be at least 2 videos a week, hopefully, from now on. Leave your thoughts in the comments below about how you think each team performed, and thanks for watching.